Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Good afternoon. My name is Chitra Jayachandran, and I'm from the CNAI Central Accessibility team. Welcome for our webinar series. Today's topic is going to be tooltips, an investigation into 4 parts. And I have invited my colleague to give this presentation out to you. With that said, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah. She's from the CNAI Accessibility team. So over to you, Sarah.
So I hate tooltips. And over the next 45 minutes or so, as Chitra mentioned, I'm really hoping to take all of you on this journey with me and hopefully help you hate tooltips just as much as I do. So as Chitra mentioned, this is an investigation in 4 parts. And Mary, if you could show the slides, that would be awesome. Yes, thank you. A colorful investigation in 4 parts. So to start off on this journey fueled by tooltip hate and lots of investigation into tooltips, we're going to start at the very beginning, which is, what is a tooltip? It's a weird word, right? Like tips for tools, what does that mean? It's not a hammer. And the answer is actually more complicated than you might think. You picture in your head something that's pretty simple usually, maybe, hopefully, which is text. Right, a simple line of text right next to a control, much like maybe this add tab button in the top right of this slide where there's an icon and a little title, native browser title tooltip that says add tab next to it. Or there are a couple other simple lines of text that you might see on this slide. On the Twitter icon, it says click to share on Twitter. On YouTube, if you hover over the play or pause button, you will see the word play or pause pop up. And then there's sometimes more complicated things that we still, for some reason, call tooltips. Like on Wikipedia, if you hover over a link or a footnote link, you will get a little preview of what you might see if you actually click on that. In Azure, if you hover over any of the Azure services, you will see a little hover card pop up that not only has text, but has links, buttons, structured information. Same goes on GitHub. If you hover over someone's profile image, you see structured information about that person. And these are all things that people sometimes call tooltips, or often call tooltips, but they don't have much relation to each other. Sometimes it's very simple text, sometimes it's a preview, sometimes it's structured information. And so because of this, the idea of a tooltip really isn't a purposeful idea. It's a visual language. It's something that appears on mouse hover, sometimes keyboard focus, but really, usually we're talking about mouse hover. It overlays other content, and it's usually in close proximity to whatever triggered it. So you mouse over a control, and a tooltip is something that pops up right next to your mouse. And there are also some commonalities in interaction, the hover thing I mentioned. And usually, unlike a modal, where if you open a modal, you have to close it at least, or you have to interact with it in some way, a tooltip is usually non-blocking. You can often ignore it if you want to. But these are not commonalities in purpose. They're commonalities in visuals, and they're commonalities in certain types of interaction. And to get to what I mean by a commonality in purpose, let's look at some other patterns that do have commonalities in purpose. There's a table, for instance. A table, the purpose of a table is to present data and specifically two-dimensional relationships in data. So you can easily skim column relationships and row relationships. And a table is structured and is there in order to make that easy. That's the purpose of a table. Of tabs, the purpose of tabs is to have a group of related panels, but let you focus only on one at a time. Like in a code editor like VS Code pictured, you can look at one file at a time and switch between files. A toolbar is a set of related actions, usually buttons, that let you perform actions on one single region. In this case, you have a bunch of text formatting actions in a toolbar that all allow you to control the formatting of a region of text. You can have a tree, which is a way to present hierarchical relationships between actionable items. Like in File Explorer, you can easily explore through files and folders and move through that hierarchy. As a side note, for some reason, a lot of UI patterns begin with T. I don't know why. But let's go back to tooltips, the original T UI pattern. And let's try to write something, like try to actually make a purposeful description of a tooltip. We could maybe say that a tooltip is extra non-essential helper text. This is kind of like the original browser tooltip, the title attribute. And that was maybe what it was intended to be originally, but that doesn't really fit all of the tooltips from earlier. A hover card is not really text, and it's not always non-essential. And we often nowadays use tooltips as an alternative for something like icons or icon buttons or other graphical elements. And that's not non-essential either, and it's not really helper text, it's more like alternative text. But a tooltip, we can't define a tooltip as alternative text either, because it is still used for things like extra descriptions and maybe even form errors. So we get back to this original problem, which is that tooltips are a visual pattern, not a functional pattern. There isn't one function that you can say all tooltips fall under. And so when we start our next section, which is trying to define tooltip semantics, this really presents a problem because the whole idea of semantics is to encode a visual language, visual purpose, into a single programmatically exposed meaning. And if tooltips don't have one meaning, then we can't give them one set of semantics and say these are tooltip semantics. So let's get something out of the way really quickly to start with semantics, which is often when people think semantics, they think ARIA roles, at least on the web. And if you go to the ARIA spec and if you search for the word tooltip, you will find there is a role of tooltip. And in the spec definition for the tooltip role, it says that a tooltip is a contextual pop-up that displays a description for an element. And authors should ensure that they use ARIA described by if they use a tooltip. And so what this means is that the role tooltip in the spec really only refers to tooltips that are this very simple, narrow definition of a description for a control. It's essentially a mirror of the title attribute, and you can't use the tooltip role to mean anything other than that. So it's very narrow. It doesn't cover everything that we consider a tooltip on the web. And also, ARIA described by is actually the attribute here that's doing the heavy lifting. The tooltip role doesn't actually do anything, and it's often not even exposed by screen readers. So it's kind of useless. Honestly, you can kind of ignore the tooltip role and you won't miss out on anything. So to get into the actual semantic problem of tooltips, the core of it is often that tooltips are used as a name or as a description, and there are different semantics for each. These are two very common examples of name and descriptive tooltips. One is you have an icon button. In this case, I've shown an icon that is for aligning text to the left, and you have a tooltip that says text align left. That tooltip is functioning as the button's accessible name. And then you can have a form field that has an accessible name already. It's named username and has a visible label, but then the tooltip provides some extra description. And that's not functioning as its name, it's functioning very much as its description. So semantically, you need to mark these up differently, even though they're both tooltips. For a tooltip functioning as a name, you would use the ARIA labeled by attribute. And for a tooltip functioning as a description, you would use ARIA described by. This actually isn't specific to tooltips. These are what you would use if you had any text that you wanted to associate with a control as a name or description, regardless of whether it's presented as tooltips, which is another kind of result of this problem of tooltips not being a functional pattern. The semantics of tooltips are not specific to them being tooltips. They're specific to what purpose they're fulfilling for the control in question. And another brief aside, there's this common pattern that keeps coming up where something has an accessible name already and the tooltip duplicates that accessible name. In that case, you do not want the tooltip to function as the description. You don't want to duplicate the same text for a name and description, and that's going to happen if you use the browser's title attribute, because the title attribute by default is a description. So it's just generally bad to use the title attribute for accessible names. Small pet peeve of mine. So some kind of more out there uses of tooltips, one of which is using tooltips to display an error message, which is maybe a description, but maybe something else. There is actually something in the ARIA spec called ARIA-error message that you can use to associate tooltip text or any other text with a form field if that tooltip or other text is functioning as an error. But actually that doesn't have as good support as aria described by, so sometimes it's just better to use aria described by for form errors as well as for form descriptions. And even more out there are this idea of hover cards. Pictured is a Twitter hover card. This is what happens if you hover over someone's username, or sorry, someone's handle on Twitter. You get a little card that has their profile image, a follow button, some description, some information about followers. And this is structured information, and sometimes it even contains interactive elements. And so this kind of brings up something very important to remember when dealing with tooltips, which is that if you're using a screen reader, or even if you're not using a screen reader, you're not interacting directly with the tooltip. You're actually interacting with the control that called up the tooltip, in this case, the profile handle link. And so if you're using a screen reader, you're not interacting with a tooltip. You don't get any of the semantics of the tooltip. What you get is all of the text in the tooltip as one long string with no semantic breakup. It's just one long string all at once. And that's really not helpful if you have this more structured information. So in this case, there really is no good way to semantically mark up this tooltip in association with the control that called it up, because it's just not a good description. It's obviously not the name. You're kind of out of luck. There aren't good semantics for this. And so as I mentioned, like tooltip content is not really independent of the control it's tied to. The way you semantically expose a tooltip, because again, you're not interacting with the tooltip, you're interacting with the control, is just by associating the text of the tooltip with that control. That can work for simpler text, but it doesn't work well for structured text. You shouldn't really think of a tooltip as content in its own right. It's kind of like an asterisk on a control. It's an addendum to a control's information. And as far as interaction with the control is concerned, if you're using a screen reader, it doesn't actually matter whether that content is in a tooltip or not. Someone using a screen reader probably isn't, if they can't see, they probably aren't even going to know whether or not this text is in a tooltip or is just on the page. So a lot of that section about semantics was focused on screen readers because a lot of the importance of semantics for accessibility deals with screen readers. But don't worry, in this next section, I will be talking about why tooltips suck for everyone else too. And that kind of gets into interaction, because the interaction of tooltips presents accessibility problems beyond just screen readers into other forms of other input modalities like switches, keyboard only, touch, other pointers, eye control, voice control, things like that. So to talk about interaction, I do want to take a brief second to talk about the history of tooltips in the browser, because the history of tooltips is long and storied. Tooltips actually turned 27 this year. They might be 27 already. When I wrote this at the beginning of the year. And that might even be older than some of the people listening to this webinar, which makes me feel old. But the point is, they've been around a while. And despite the fact that tooltips are so old, no modern browser currently supports showing the title attribute on focus. It's been almost 3 decades, and we still don't have keyboard accessibility for tooltips. I do want, as a side note, we used to have keyboard accessibility for tooltips in Edge and Internet Explorer, but that went away when Edge moved to Chromium. But the point remains, it's been almost 3 decades, and we have this native HTML feature that still has major sweeping accessibility issues. And it's one of those cases where using a native HTML feature is not actually best for accessibility. Like often accessibility practitioners will say, like, use the native thing, use the HTML thing, don't build it yourself. For tooltips, this isn't actually true. You can do better than the native title attribute with like a line of CSS by displaying something with both a focus and a hover state. And if you do that, you are now making it accessible for people on desktop who are using a mouse. This is the same as with the title attribute, but then you add people on desktop using a keyboard. You do actually have people on mobile using a keyboard as well there. And you have people who use touch or eye gaze or things like that on form inputs. on form inputs like text inputs and text areas. Because if you're using a pointer, you can focus a form input and then you'll see the tooltip. But this still doesn't work in a number of places. If you're using a touch screen and you have a tooltip on a link or a button or some static text, you're still not going to get the tooltip because you can't focus on a button or a link without also activating it. So you're not going to get the tooltip there. For the same reason, you're not going to make the tooltip accessible to people using other pointers that don't have hover, like eye gaze, or if you're using a switch device with the mouse grid, you don't have hover there either. And you also cause issues for people using magnification software like Zoom Text. Technically, they'll still be able to access the tooltip, but it makes it much harder to consume and read and control the display of the tooltip if you're using magnification. And for that reason, there's actually this new criterion in WCAG 2.1. WCAG, if you don't know, stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's a set of accessibility guidelines that govern various requirements for making things accessible and is referenced in laws and stuff like that. And you may have run into this if you try to comply with WCAG 2.1. It's called content on hover focus, and as I like to call it, it's the tooltip criterion. It doesn't only apply to tooltips, it also applies to things like menu drop-downs if they show up on hover, or really anything that shows up as a result of hover or focus. But tooltips are one major common UI component that now has this extra criterion. And it's primarily geared towards making tooltips more accessible to people who have low vision and use magnification software. And it adds 3 new interaction requirements to tooltips and any other content on hover or focus, but let's be honest, tooltips. Tooltips have to be dismissible, which means that you have to be able to get rid of the tooltip without moving your pointer or focus. And this is really important if you're using magnification because your field of view is going to be centered around either your keyboard focus or your pointer. So if you have to move either of those to get rid of the tooltip, what you're essentially saying is you need to move your field of view in order to dismiss the tooltip, and that doesn't really work. So you have to be able to dismiss it without doing that. For the same reason, a tooltip has to be hoverable. So you have to be able to move your pointer over the tooltip because, again, your field of view follows the pointer. So if you want to read a tooltip, especially a larger tooltip, you may have to move your pointer over it. So it needs to stay on the screen if you move your pointer over it. And finally, it needs to be persistent, which means it needs to not disappear after a timeout. And this is just because if it takes you longer to look at a tooltip, maybe because you have to manipulate your field of view around, or it just takes you longer to read it for whatever reason, it's not going to disappear on you. So those first two, hoverable and persistent, those are the easier requirements, let's say. To break them down, I've made this example. It's an icon that has a trash can on it and a tooltip that says delete. So I've moved my mouse over it. You can see the tooltip's kind of staying there. It's not going away, so it needs persistent. And if I move my pointer, I know my pointer is kind of small. I'm moving my pointer from the button over to the text of the word delete, and the tooltip is staying up. So that meets hoverable. If I move my pointer away, it dismisses. The difficult one is to meet dismissible without moving your pointer and without moving your keyboard focus. For keyboard, this isn't too hard because if you're using keyboard, your focus is going to be on whatever control called up the tooltip, so you can add a keyboard handler to that control that handles whatever key you choose. For the sake of argument, for the moment, let's say that's escape because that's the first key that most people think of. We'll talk about why escape might not be a good idea in a bit, but for the moment, if you implement the escape key, or if you implement a keyboard listener that handles the escape key on your tooltip control, you can probably make it dismiss without changing focus. For pointer users, that's a lot harder because you need to make it go away without requiring the user to move the pointer, which probably means a keyboard listener, even for people who are using their mouse. And if you try to do that, what that means is you have no idea where focus is. You have no idea what element is capturing the keyboard event. And so you can have a tooltip within a modal, you could have a tooltip within an iframe, you could have a tooltip on a combo box, You could have all these options, and if you try to implement the escape key, what's going to happen is the modal's going to close, or the combo box is going to collapse, or nothing's going to happen if you're trying to handle something across an iframe, because you can't do that. And anyone who's using a mobile device or a pointer device without the keyboard obviously isn't going to have access to a keyboard, so it's just not going to work for them. So that doesn't work very well, especially with the escape key, because the escape key does so many other things like close modals and combo boxes and switch modes in a screen reader. So if escape doesn't work, what are your options? I didn't have a good answer for this originally, so what ended up happening was with my team, we made a usability study specifically for testing tooltips, because I can't resist an opportunity to test multiple issues of tooltips. This wasn't just about methods of dismissal, but also just how usable tooltips were overall. So the first part of the study tested tooltips versus other methods of giving instructions within a form. What those methods were a toggle tip, a button that showed or hid a little bubble of extra information, like a tooltip, except instead of showing up on hover or focus, you actually had to press a button. There was a tooltip that showed up on hover or focus of the control in question, of the form field in question. And finally, there was just static text. No tooltip, nothing that went away. It was just static text next to the form field. And we ran this study. We had this focused mostly on low vision users, although also included some screen reader users and some people who had mobility impairments. And what we found was that people didn't like tooltips. The TLDR. Tooltips are not wonderful for usability, but some of the specific problems were somebody using magnification on a mobile device was annoyed that their iOS keyboard would pop up over the tooltip and they couldn't actually consume the tooltip. This was whenever the form field was in focus. People using screen readers wanted to be able to review the tooltip character by character, especially for something like form field instructions that can be very important to really make sure you understand. Having that just associated via described by and just associated as a description wasn't enough, because they wanted to interact with the text itself. And remember, tooltips are not a thing you interact with separately from the control, especially if you're using a screen reader. So the text wasn't reviewable, and that was really annoying for some people. And it was hard to show or hide, because it shows up automatically when you hover or focus the control. And so that takes away some of the control from users who want to be able to control when to show it and when to hide it. In general, the theme of this usability study is people want control over their browsing experience. They want to be able to review text when they want to review it. They want to be able to show or hide text on their own when they want to see it. And tooltips take a lot of that control away. Finally, the last piece of feedback was it looked a bit annoying, but that was probably just a comment on my design skills, or lack of design skills. There's a reason I'm not a designer. So the recommendation that came out of this study was really toggle tips worked great. People liked toggle tips. People liked having a button that showed extra information. A number of people actually even liked that better than static text, because if you're using a magnification software like Zoom Text, having the label immediately next to the control was pretty nice, because when you're focused on the control, you can see both at once. So static text didn't actually block anyone. Static text ended up being very usable, but some people did in fact prefer toggle tips even to static text. And everyone preferred everything to tooltips. So the second part of this study had to do with dismissing tooltips specifically. And to do this, I made four different methods of dismissing tooltips. Two of those were close buttons. One was with the close button in the traditional place in the top right corner, and one was a kind of creative close button placement right next to the control that triggered it. So because the tooltip shows up on hover, this close button was designed to be as close to where the mouse was hovered as possible, so you didn't have to move your mouse very much to dismiss the tooltip. And then also there were keyboard methods of dismissal using either the escape key or the control key. And what we found out, this was again run primarily by low vision users with some screen reader users and some people with mobility issues who used a switch or keyboard only. And the feedback was that when close buttons were present, people who used the mouse or a pointer liked close buttons. So for both of the tooltips that had close buttons, they also could be dismissed with the keyboard. All of the tooltips could be dismissed with the keyboard, but when close buttons were present, people used close buttons. So close buttons seem like a good thing, no matter where they're placed. But even though people who used a pointer, people who could see, liked close buttons, the position of the close button did actually matter. There was a strong preference for not needing to like navigate your mouse all the way over to a close button over if you could have a close button immediately next to where the mouse currently was. So having a close button close to the control that triggered the tooltip was actually very helpful, especially for people who are using a magnification software, because remember, you're navigating your field of view around as you move your pointer. And for people who are using the keyboard, there was a strong preference for control over escape, or more particularly, there were some issues that surfaced with the escape key, which is that I did actually test having tooltips within a modal. And even though I'd handled the escape key within the modal so that it would only close the tooltip if a tooltip was present and not the modal, people were afraid to press the escape key within a modal because they thought the escape would close the modal. There's just this expectation, if you're in a modal, escape is going to close the modal. So this also would hold true if you were in a combo box or, on any other type of control that already handles escape. There's an expectation that escape is already going to do something. So escape is not a very good key to dismiss tooltips, especially because a lot of people might not even be aware of tooltips. If you're using a screen reader, remember, you're just interacting with the tooltip text as text, not as a tooltip. So if you make escape do something for a tooltip, someone using a screen reader is going to expect escape to do something else, and it's not going to do that, and that's going to be confusing. So escape is kind of already overloaded, and it turns out it doesn't do well for tooltips. The control key did better, but the problem was people didn't know about it as much as with escape. So you just have to make sure you communicate that a control key does something, and then it's much better than escape. Oh, and tooltips are still not reviewable if you're using a screen reader. I know I keep saying that, but it was just a common complaint that just kept coming up. Main takeaway, as far as dismissible goes at least, is that if you give people a close button, they'll use the close button. So it's probably good to give people a close button. But if you remember what that WCAG criterion said from the beginning, the requirement is that you have to be able to dismiss it without moving the pointer. And obviously a close button doesn't fulfill this because you have to move the pointer to the close button. So then we get this tension between what we found out in the usability study and what the technical, legal requirement is. So my hot take, my personal hot take, is that we should go for what works for users and not what WCAG says. Often WCAG, the intent is there to be good for users, but sometimes the details aren't the best. In this particular case, I think the details are not the best, and in that case, we should do what's best for users. I don't think we should follow that requirement that you have to dismiss without moving the pointer. We should just pay attention to the intent, that you shouldn't put undue burden on people using magnification software, and ideally put the close button somewhere easy to click with a pointer. But I think we can do better than what WCAG says. We can do this instead. And this isn't the be-all end-all of tooltip design, by the way. I'm not a designer. This was my attempt to fulfill a set of requirements or a set of user needs. I'm sure if you pay attention to those user needs, that the close button should be easy to access and that you should be able to dismiss a tooltip. Someone is going to make something better than this tooltip, so please keep iterating. But I think this is a better solution to tooltip dismissal for pointer users. And finally, let's get into hover card interaction. Let's move past WCAG and get into the weird stuff. I mentioned the semantic issues with this before, with hover cards, where if you have structured content that shows up on hover, that structure is not going to be communicated and it's going to be hard to understand. But structure and semantics are not the only issue with hover cards. There's also interaction problems. And those interaction problems include, as I mentioned, they'll be read all at once by screen readers, and not only will it be read all at once, it's going to be hard to go through and find the actual hover card so you can get that structure, because often it's not DOM adjacent. And by that I mean this tooltip needs to overlay everything else, right? It's an overlay. So the only way to really guarantee that is often to put it at the end of the DOM. And that means if you're using a screen reader, it's going to be hard to find. So it's going to be hard to interact with it using a screen reader, and also using the keyboard for the same reason. You're not just going to be able to tab to it. Even if you implement tabbing, you're going to do some screwy stuff with DOM order, and it's not going to be particularly expected to tab from one thing, to tab from the control that triggered it into the pop-up, because maybe you're just tabbing through and you didn't want to tab into the pop-up, and if you tab into the pop-up, that breaks a whole nother set of expectations. So there just isn't really a good way to access this with the keyboard or to access this with the screen reader, especially because it has interactive items in it. This is a pain for magnification users, even above and beyond the normal pain of smaller tooltips, because this is a large tooltip and you are definitely going to need to move your field of view to be able to read all of this. But the problem is, because you didn't put it there, because it's only there because you're hovered, you have to be really careful not to move your pointer off of it or it's going to disappear, and you're going to have to go back to that original control and hover it again, and that's just a pain. And finally, it's a pain for everyone else too. As I mentioned, screen reader users, keyboard users, Zoom text users, but also people using a touch screen aren't going to get this, and it's bad for cognitive accessibility as well, because you have these things popping up that are distracting and maybe overwhelming, and you weren't in control of them and you didn't expect them. So it's just all around not good, because again, you're taking control away from the user. If something shows up on hover or focus, that wasn't an explicit action by the user to have something show up, they just wanted to hover or focus a control. So to have extra stuff just popping up on hover or focus, you're taking away control from the user and giving it to the author, and that generally is just bad for accessibility and bad for happiness of all of your users. And so my solution to this is often a toggle tip. Just have a button that shows or hides the extra information, and you give that control back to the user. And it's just much better for keyboard accessibility, better for screen reader accessibility, and better for everyone. Yes, that was interaction. Let's dive into my final section of improving tooltip accessibility, which is writing content for the tooltip. And you might wonder, like, why is a developer talking about content writing? I'm not a content writer. This isn't my area of expertise. And I'm not really going to talk about good text word stuff, because obviously that's not my forte. Actually, what I'm going to do is bring the perspective of a developer and the perspective of how tooltips work to highlight some problems with writing content for tooltips. And that is essentially that when you write content for tooltips, you encounter this paradox. When you're creating a tooltip, you have to assume that some people are never going to be able to access it. That's just kind of the bottom line. There are going to be people who cannot access your tooltip, whether that's because they're on a touch screen or they're using a keyboard or whatever. So the content within a tooltip must not be necessary to use the UI, because some people aren't going to be able to access it. But if the content isn't necessary, why do you have the tooltip? And the answer to that is essentially that we have this long and storied history on the web of being okay creating experiences only for certain people. That's kind of captured in this tweet by the absolutely wonderful Billy Gregory that is from 5 years ago, but just keeps getting quoted again and again because it's so wonderful. And he says, when UX doesn't consider all users, shouldn't it be known as some users' experience, or sucks? And that's really what tooltips are. They are fundamentally only for some users. And to kind of hammer home why we have tooltips, why this is the case, and why this keeps happening, I'm just going to go a little bit into tooltip history again and talk about the saga of alt text. Alt text is writing alternative text for images. And this kind of begins back in the early days of the web, back in the time of Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer 5. And there's this graphic on the screen of those two logos, Netscape and IE5, with a little speech bubble that says, "Remember us." And what I did just then was essentially say alt text for that image. But when images were first introduced to the web, there was no possibility to define alternative text for them. The image tag predates alt text. So when images were first created, they were fundamentally inaccessible. And to fix this, browsers and HTML spec authors introduced the alt attribute. But the way it was implemented at the start was the alt attribute actually created a tooltip, similar to the title attribute now. And what happened when this new attribute created a visual tooltip that sighted people could see is that authors started writing alt text content for visual users. And so we got these gems such as, "This image is mapped, please download it." This is the alternative text for an image, by the way. "Self-explanatory. Turn on image loading, damn it." And "sorry, not available with your web client." Those last two were specifically for sighted people using text-only browsers. And none of these actually helped accessibility whatsoever, because you took an attribute intended for accessibility, or people then took an attribute intended for accessibility and made it and used it for sighted people. And so because this kept happening, the HTML spec authors and browsers introduced the title attribute to images and made that the tooltip and made alt text, the alt attribute, not a tooltip. And so, of course, that fixed all accessibility problems, because now alt text is alt text and the title is a tooltip and everything is good, right? Obviously not. The title attribute just introduced all of these other accessibility problems that we just talked about, to the point where in the HTML spec on the W3C, there was this note about how please don't use the title attribute, it's bad for accessibility, which is a wonderful note to exist in the HTML spec about something that's built into HTML. But I think all of this kind of shows the circular nature of accessibility in web development. We had images and they were inaccessible, and so we created the alt attribute to make them more accessible. Then that got messed up because it was just used for able-bodied people, and to fix that, we added the title attribute. And then now that's accessible, and it's been almost 3 decades and it's still inaccessible. And it's not just tooltips that this has happened to. This happens over and over and over again with things like long description that was dropped from the spec because it was misused, or ARIA controls that no screen readers use anymore because it was misused. Or I feel like the history of tables on the web is the history of misusing HTML and making it inaccessible. That would be a whole nother talk about why tables are so weird and why there are so many gotchas with table accessibility. But it just keeps happening, and really it's because every part of building for the web, from the spec to the browsers to web authors, start from this place of building things for able-bodied people, enabled people. And until we fix that, we're going to have tooltips, because every facet of this, browsers made the title attribute into a tooltip that was inaccessible. There's probably another way to expose that information. There's nothing about like an HTML attribute specifically that says it must be inaccessible, but browsers decided to create a presentation that was inaccessible, and we still have it. So the platform has an accessibility problem. The HTML spec has an accessibility problem, where, you know, image existed before alt, and then alt existed before the title attribute, at least on images. And title is still there. It's still in the HTML spec. And even this note about accessibility is no longer in the HTML spec. It's only on the W3C version and not on the WhatWG version. And then, of course, web authors have screwed up alt attribute accessibility and title accessibility in ways that, you know, the platform and screen readers have to keep responding to. And so we go in circles, and so we still have tooltips. And what we really should have done from the very start was just not expose things as tooltips. We should have found a pattern that was better from the very start. But I know that's not going to happen today, or tomorrow, or this week, or this month, or this year. And I know we have to deal with tooltips as they are. So, you know, go ahead, write tooltips, fix tooltips. When you do so, try to keep the content within tooltips short, so it's easily reviewable. So because it's not reviewable, it's easily understandable if you're using a screen reader, so you don't have to move your view around a whole lot if you're using magnification. And so it's not really blocking or creating too much distraction visually. Try to keep in mind the purpose of the tooltip when you're creating semantics for it, and make the semantics match the purpose and not the visuals. And make the tooltip non-essential, because no matter what you do, it's not going to be available for everyone. Now, I've spent almost 45 minutes talking about how much tooltips kind of suck. And now that I've brought you along this journey, my journey of tooltip hatred, what is it that we can do beyond these patches? What I really want to come out of this talk isn't just that tooltips are bad, because this goes beyond tooltips. This is like in combo box tree grids and tables that aren't really tables and all of this other stuff. What I really want to come out of this is the idea that we spend a lot of time taking visual patterns that were created for abled people, and we try to make them accessible. We try to put accessibility on top of them. And that's how we end up with tooltips today, and that's how we end up with 45 minutes of hating tooltips. Because what we really should have done from the very start was go back to the original need. Is that a need for creating more text, like helper text that isn't in the screen by default? Is that a need for labeling icons? What we should do is go back to that need and try to solve it from the beginning in a way that works for everyone. So I hope the next time you struggle over tooltip accessibility, you're not asking, how do I make this tooltip accessible, but why am I adding this text to the UI? Where else could it go? How can I solve this in a way that works for everyone? And this, again, tooltips are 27 years old, and we think of them as this core part of the UI, but remember, society is ableist, and every part of the web, every visual convention of the web was probably created for abled people. And so it's fine to rethink it, even if it's been around a while, even if it's a convention that you think is like some core part of the web. It doesn't need to be. It could probably be better. My personal recommendations for how tooltips could be better are maybe use a toggle tip instead. Those tend to work pretty well. And consider static strings. Consider not having it be dynamic, just having it be present on the UI, especially for shorter strings. This can sometimes work for icon alt text, and this can sometimes work for descriptions for things like form fields. Or also be creative. I can't solve all the use cases for tooltips, but I'm sure everyone here, because there's so many very intelligent, very passionate people out there trying to fix accessibility, I'm sure all of you can find things that are much better than what I suggested. So please do, and when you make new patterns, please, from the very start, design them for everyone. And that is it.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, we'll take some questions. We do have some questions on chat here, so I'm going to throw it at you. The first question is, unlike screen reader users that have elements with alternative text or labels, what is the alternative for sighted users to find out what icons or terms mean without the helper text, if not tooltips?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's kind of an unsolved question. I think this kind of goes back to things being designed for abled people, and this goes for cognitive accessibility as well, where the assumption is, one, that people easily are able to interpret icons, even sometimes simple icons, and two, that people are able to see tooltips. I think if you approach the idea of, I need to communicate this idea, even in a compact space, how do I make that accessible for everyone? You're probably not going to come up with an icon with a tooltip. Some things I've seen are sometimes you have a menu, like maybe a menu along the side that has a row of icons and that has text next to each icon, and you can collapse that or you can expand it, and that's collapsing or expanding the text. So you get some extra room but still give people the option to see text in a way that's not in a tooltip. Or you can, like in some cases, like for the menu button particularly, you could just just put the name of the thing next to the icon. Have both the icon and the text present. But pretty much my suggestion is to consider things that are not tooltips. Try to solve it from the beginning in a way that works for everyone.
Awesome. Okay, are you ready for the next one?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the next question is, I love the user research that was incorporated into figuring out alternatives to tooltips. For dismissing tooltips, would the control key conflict with the screen reader controls? Screen readers like narrator use control to stop narrator from reading out text labels, etc.
So that's actually a thing that I think is in favor of using the control key, because it's very similar, dismissing a tooltip and stopping a screen reader from reading what it's currently reading, which might be the tooltip. It's kind of saying stop giving the extra verbosity, and dismissing a tooltip is kind of a visual equivalent to saying stop giving the extra verbosity. So for people who are using screen readers who can't see, dismissing the tooltip with a control key doesn't really matter because it's not changing anything. If you are using a screen reader and can see, it's kind of a similarity, or I think it's kind of a similar functionality in that if you're trying to stop screen reader verbosity, you also at the same time stop visual or collapse visual verbosity.
Okay.
It would be good to combine with a way to also like get the tooltips back. So if control toggles the tooltip, then if you didn't mean to dismiss it, you could get it back.
Right, thanks. There's two more questions, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is there some standard approach to let the user focus into the content of the tooltip, something like pressing Alt and down so that the user can access its content with the screen reader and navigate through the elements of the tooltip? So
Alt down is a common way to get into combo boxes or menus, so I get where that's coming from. There is not currently a standard way to enter into tooltips. I don't think Alt down would work because you can have tooltips on things like combo boxes, and Alt down is going to open the combo box. Same for something like a menu. So because you can combine tooltips with all these other forms of UI, trying to co-opt keyboard interactions that do things to UI is difficult. Yeah, ARIA controls was supposed to do that, actually. Like ARIA controls, the attribute was supposed to give you this ability to jump from a control, from like a UI element like a button to the thing it controls, like a tooltip. Yeah, that went away because people misused it. And because a lot of screen readers didn't implement it. JAWS was the only one that did. There isn't anything right now, unfortunately. Okay. It's part of the reason modals work better, because then you move focus, and that's what makes it work.
All right. There's one more question. What is the sample size of this study?
Yes, I actually removed those slides because they were a little information dense. But so if I remember right, the sample size was about 12 people. Yes, 12 people, 7 low vision users, 3 blind users, and 2 people with mobility impairments, 1 who used Dragon Naturally Speaking, so a speech recognition software, and 1 who used a head switch. There were actually 2 studies, one with the forms and one with the tooltip dismissal, and it was both roughly that breakdown, but just different people. And there were a lot of commonalities in the issues found with tooltips across both studies. So 2 studies of 12 people each. Awesome. Okay, all right. So there's one more question. I think we have time. We can take this question here. The toggle tip suggestion is interesting, and my understanding is that it would be displayed when pressing enter or space on the target element. Is that correct? Yep. If that's the case, how can we follow this pattern when the target element itself is already clickable and presents its own behavior on click, and we want to let the user display the toggle tip without activating the click behavior of the target element? Yes, so you would need a different element. You would need to combine the main control with a separate button. Visually, you can do this in various ways. Like if you have a form, for instance, you could just have like a little information button that's present somewhere besides the form control. Yeah, the context is going to be different. Like the way you solve this is going to be different for each like separate context. And there might be other solutions. Maybe a toggle tip isn't the best solution for you. If you have something like a bunch of buttons in a menu, you're not going to have a separate toggle tip button for each one. So like different contexts require different solutions. And if it really doesn't make sense to have a second button, then maybe a toggle tip isn't for you. And maybe there's another solution out there somewhere.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. So with that said, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed the webinar session. Stay tuned and we'll catch you back at the next webinar.
Also, really quick.
Sure.
Yes, my slides are online on GitHub. I put the link in the chat, and I assume whenever the video's up, it'll be in the video description as well.
Yes, do. Thank you, everyone.